Donald Trump has just made a pretty significant post on Truth Social. I'm just going to read the whole thing. Based on the lack of respect that China has shown to the world markets, I am hereby raising the tariff charged to China by the United States to 125% effective immediately. At some point, hopefully in the near future, China will realize that the days of ripping off the USA and other countries is no longer sustainable or acceptable. Conversely, and based on the fact that more than 75 countries have called representatives of the United States, including Departments of Commerce, Treasury, and the USTR, to negotiate a solution to the subjects being discussed relative to trade barriers, tariffs, currency manipulation, and non-monetary tariffs, that those countries have not, at my strong suggestion, retaliated in any way, shape, or form against the United States. Here's a key line. I have authorized a 90-day pause and a substantially lowered reciprocal tariff during this period of 10%, also effective immediately. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Do you see, Ryan Nobles, the hand of any pressure of folks on the Hill where you are in this announcement?
Listen, Chris, there's definitely a lot of angst up here on Capitol Hill about the form and fashion in which these tariffs have been delivered. But we have seen Republicans, at least publicly, tell us that they're willing to give the president some time to see this through. But privately, behind the scenes, we know that they are getting phone calls from constituents that are really worried about their 401ks. They're getting calls from constituents who own small businesses who are worried about the impacts of these tariffs. The volume of this concern just seems to be increasing by the day. So that message, we are told, is being relayed to the White House with a degree of urgency. And there was some expectation that this entire process was, had the opportunity to shift on a dime at any moment, which is, it appears it has in this regard. So, while Donald Trump has said that he was going to see this through long term, anything can change at any given moment. And as we see the markets reacting, I talked to one senator today who said that with as simple as a Truth Social post, Donald Trump could send the markets back into green territory. And that's exactly what we see happening here. That volatility, though, cuts both ways. And, we'll have to see how congressional Republicans feel about not having a very specific long-term strategy with an end game. That's what we continue to hear over and over from congressional Republicans. Mr. President, you have the ability and the right to see your economic vision forward, but you need to give us some guidance as to how you get to the end of this. How does this plane land? And a lot of the angst, I think, from congressional Republicans comes from that idea that they just seem to be shooting from the hip, and there's not a long-term strategy as to how to bring this all in to one specific strategy that is a long-term economic benefit to the United States, Chris.
Ryan Nobles, thank you. And take a look at the Dow, at least starting to respond all the way coming up already. I want to bring back in Neil Irwin, chief economic correspondent for Axios, NBC senior White House correspondent Garrett Haake, and NBC senior business correspondent Christine Romans. Talk about what we're seeing on the Dow and talk about this announcement by the president.
Well, that's a big move in the Dow. 6% in one move is a lot. We're back above 40,000. Remember, we were at 42,200 or so just a few days ago when this whole tariff tantrum started, when the president and the counterparties started firing back and forth each other. Look, this is the president saying in his Truth Social post that the 75 countries who came up to him and kissed his, as you know, what he said yesterday, that he's going to give them a break for 90 days while they work through all of these things. China, though, he's really putting the screws to China and actually adding to the amount, the tariff amount on China. So talking about saying that China has showed a lack of respect to the world's market. So he's picking 75 countries they'll continue to work with. Clearly, Wall Street likes the sound of that. They don't love the trade war.
What do we, Garrett, to make of this decision by the president and the timing of it?
Well, look, it's an extraordinary reversal from the president, who's been saying for days he wouldn't do exactly this. But he's been facing a ton of pressure from both the markets and from Republicans to target these tariffs in a more structured way, in a way that they can defend. And I think this will give those elected Republicans exactly what they asked for. I think there's much more appetite on the Hill, as Ryan was alluding to have a more direct trade confrontation with China, who Secretary Bessent was saying even this morning is the worst offender when it comes to unfair trade practices. But to let some of these other countries, many of whom we have trade treaties with or trade deals with, or including some negotiated by President Trump, essentially off the hook, and to not have a global trade war on all fronts at all times with allies and adversaries alike. Clearly, the market likes it. Congressional Republicans, even I think some congressional Democrats will probably applaud this. They see China as kind of a global trade cheater in some ways, too. So focusing more narrowly on that, I think, will be perceived as a victory. But the president, had been very clear that, he wasn't going to take this kind of step. Remember, the big picture reasoning for these tariffs is to reshore manufacturing from all over the globe, to essentially rebuild America's industrial base. I'm not sure that targeting just China and a 90-day pause will do that. And it certainly adds to the question of uncertainty that has roiled the markets and political leaders around the world. If the president has said for the last week that he wouldn't engage in a move quite like this, then he does so in the middle of the afternoon on a Wednesday, what will he do on Thursday or Friday or after the markets close, right? So a huge market move from a social media post. We do, by the way, think it's likely we will see and hear from the president in the next hour or so. He is on his schedule signing some executive orders this afternoon. He's also meeting with NASCAR champions, or racing car champions, I think not just NASCAR, a visual event that will be ripe for pun and analogy as we see the stock market really begin to take off here. But I think we'll hear from the president more fulsomely on the decision-making behind this move today, hopefully within the next hour. Again, while the markets are still open, something the investors may well enjoy as well.
Christine, I'm told you have to run, but you wanted to make a point about this 10%
I'm looking at the end. I've authorized a 90-day pause. That's what Wall Street really, really loves here, is the pause there. And a substantially lowered reciprocal tariff during this period of 10%. Remember, there was all of that discussion about just how they figured out 46% for one country, 43 for another, 20 this and that. And there were a lot of questions about the formula, just how exactly they got to that. It looks like they're lowering all of those to 10% for right now. So it's that same reciprocal tariff, and then going through from there, they'll do the negotiations.
Well, thank you for that. Neil, let me ask you for your take on this. And I think it's worth pointing out, we don't know, and maybe we'll hear from the president later today about why he decided to make this decision. He at least says at the top of this that he's been getting a lot of calls from people talking about, different things. He had sort of hinted at that yesterday, and last night talked about getting his arse kicked. But also, the S&P 500 was nearing a bear market. There was all the political pressure. How do you view this statement from the president?
Yeah, look, it's obviously a relief rally for markets. There's, a lot of relief if you're an importer who are looking at 46% from Vietnam or some of these numbers in the near future. That said, look, first of all, keeping the 10% baseline reciprocal tariff in place for the entire world, that's 4 times what the pre-January tariff level was on average. So that's still a very large tariff relative to modern U.S. experience. And 100 and whatever percent we're on now for China. Look, China is a major trade partner. We get a ton of imports from China, a ton of consumer goods. That's going to bite if that stays in place. And then you get to the negotiations. All right, so we're doing a 90-day pause to negotiate with these 50 or 75 countries that want to come to the table to make a deal. How does that actually work? That's a lot of different countries. The U.S. has not laid out specific asks. Remember, they did this kind of crude arithmetic, this crude formula to come up with the reciprocal tariffs to begin with. So it's not like we have a list of, we want this on non-tariff barriers, this tax on this or that. There's not a specific list that the U.S. is starting with to negotiate from. So how any kind of productive negotiations happen in the next 90 days with all these different countries at once, I'm a little skeptical of. That said, for good reason, there's a big relief rally on Wall Street right now, because the worst outcomes of everything getting more expensive all at once seems to be off the table for at least 90 days.
On wild swings in the markets today, which had crashed on President Trump's massive tariffs, building the pressure that led him to partly back down today. Trump announcing a new cut to his own new tariffs, something he and other aides had ruled out as recently as a few days ago. And this cut comes without foreign countries giving the U.S. anything tangible yet. His Treasury Secretary came out to promised the world today and the markets that there is a ceiling now, so that the worst may be over. And this ceiling is something that means the flailing tariff standoff, according to the Trump White House, will not get worse, at least for everyone but China. That's the summary. Now, we're going to get to the details, and I'm actually about to show you how this played across Wall Street and across politics today. But let's just start, as we try to do around here, with the core evidence. And I have three things we can see clearly. One, Trump's tariffs are partly paused now, and that is designed to calm markets, and it is calming markets. They also, though, continue at 10% rates, which is widely viewed as a fairly unsustainable plan. Two, the market panic that we saw did melt into this huge rebound, and many are eager to believe that Trump's new line is somehow sturdier than his past claims. So we saw the rebound today of people saying, let's take the good news more seriously than some of the uncertainty and the bad news in the markets. And finally, in this summary, three, Donald Trump backs down. That is the clear fact of it. That's the New York Times headline. That's what Wall Street likes. Unlike Tom Petty, who's saying, I won't back down, I won't be turned around, Trump did back down today. Unlike 50 Cent, who memorably rapped, it's easy to see when you look at me, if you look closely, 50 don't back down. Well, it's one thing Trump does not have in common with them. Trump do back down, if you will. All right, with those three clear points in mind that are not really in dispute here in reality, let's now look at how all this went down.
There will be a 90-day pause on the reciprocal tariffs as these negotiations are ongoing, and the tariff level will be brought down to a universal 10% tariff.
Things can change rapidly. Markets have just been so volatile in recent days. You almost can't look away because you might miss a 1% move in either direction.
This was driven by the president's strategy. He and I had a long talk on Sunday, and this was his strategy all along.
It's obviously a relief rally for markets.
We've had more than 75 countries contact us, and I imagine after today there will be more.
Are the numbers I'm seeing on my screen correct here for the Dow? Are we up 840 points right now? Dana, I'm watching this literally glitching in gap. We're up 900 points. Is this, yeah, okay. There, wow.
Is this real? Wow. And those are the people in our sister network, CNBC, but among other financial journalists, the people who track this for a living and are still like, whoa, how did that much capital come flooding back into the markets? So that is a good thing that comes after a larger bad thing that is not over. All of this Trump-induced, much of it feeding uncertainty. Ordinary Americans are still going to be paying what everyone has been calling this Trump tax because, at least under the new announcement, there's still a large tariff in play. Could amount to thousands of dollars a year, depending on what you buy. The fact is that while Trump is backing down, he's still claiming to do the 10% tariff, which raises prices. And it's been an interesting week and a costly one, thanks to Trump policies. But most experts and participants view this as a self-induced American economic disaster without much clear upside, other than someone who took so much money out that when it came flooding back, they can say, look, it's not as bad as the thing we started. Some are also clamoring to try to help Donald Trump get into a place where he continues to back down and give the whole thing up. Some claim this was a strategy or that he won something in the hopes of maybe trying to flatter him into a less embarrassing off-ramp to get us all past this. But factually, when it comes to trade policy, even before you get to China, this thing isn't over right now. The current reduced tariffs carry some of the same risks that we've heard experts and MAGA allies and billionaire hedge fund managers all deride over the past week, albeit at a lower volume. I told you I'd get into the details. Well, consider how it was reported just last week when the tariffs first went into effect and we were looking at the 10% tariff. So we've deliberately showed you a slightly older headline. This is Reuters or The Guardian, referring to what is today's reality, a 10% tariff, smashing global trade norms, a seismic shift to global trade, a big bad deal at 10%. So Donald Trump has done something that many people try to do in politics or sales. They sometimes call it the anchoring effect. If I scare you at 20% and bring it down to 10, it feels like a relief. If you started out at 0 or 2 and jump up to 10, you go, oh my gosh. And so we don't know what the markets will do any more than we know what Donald Trump will do. But very recently, the experts viewed 10% as a problem. Now that's the reduced norm. Markets relieved about that. But there is still far higher uncertainty about U.S. trade policy, about U.S. credit, even about the full faith and credit of the United States and the Treasury markets and all that stuff and details if you want to get into it, because we're still in the middle of Trump backing off, but not ending his self-induced, risky tariff trade war.
Let's be clear what happened. Who capitulated here and why? And I don't want to say this because I'm a patriot. I'm an American. But it is the White House who capitulated.
He did everything right to the edge and then pulled back.
He did right. Well, yeah, you could look at it that way, or you could look at it, the gun was at his head. I mean, what happened last night was very bad.
All right. So it feels a little bit of a relief here, but I have to say 10% tariff is still a massive reordering of U.S. trade and global trade, and certainly is not an eradication of the risks that we had seen in the past week.
Let me clarify something here. This is a long way from fully backing off. This still leaves the United States as the most tariff-heavy, industrialized country in the world, and it's not even close.
He has permanently injected that uncertainty into markets. You can't really put the tariff threat toothpaste back in the tube.
I think it still raises the question of why are other countries going to deepen their ties with us after we punch them in the face?
All of this a reflection of a policy that was such a failure after saying they weren't going to lower tariffs, they weren't backing down, they weren't open negotiations, and they fought each other about that. They've backed down, but left these tariffs in place. And the voices we just showed you, you might notice, are a little different from one recovering legislation. And we see a lot of politicians. Those were financial experts, financial journalists, people tapped into that world saying this is still a huge problem. Now, Trump is saying other countries have been reaching out to make deals. Well, of course, you're going to reach out when you look at this kind of situation. But Trump was also very clearly rattled through the reporting by how things could get far worse than the drops I showed you leading into this morning.
Despite Donald Trump blinking on a bunch of the big disastrous tariffs on like the whole world, including like Madagascar and the island with the penguins, he announced today he's not just maintaining but increasing his tariffs on China, which is one of our largest trading partners. And among the Americans who will almost immediately feel the pain are farmers, because China buys a lot of their product and will slap tariffs on in response. Alex Wagner has been doing amazing reporting on the impact of Trump's policies on the ground, went to North Carolina to talk to farmers about Trump's tariffs and what it means for their future and their livelihood.
Agriculture, there's about 85% of what happens on my farm that is completely out of my control.
Yeah.
So I have to do the very best I can at managing that 15% of inputs and cost and labor and marketing and signing the best contract and doing the best job that I can, and leave the other 85% up to the good Lord. And that's all we can do, whether it's weather or disease or a hailstorm or a pandemic or administration. And we just weather the storm.
It's kind of a wait and see game. I mean, I think the main thing is not to overreact and get too nervous. I mean, stay the course. That's what's helped us, all of these generations of farmers stay in the course and doing what we do best and being efficient, not spending money when we don't need to spend money, and just keeping our ears open and eyes open and being able to pivot when we can.
Here with me now is Alex Wagner, MSNBC senior political analyst and host of the Trumpland podcast. I loved those quotes because I think it's actually a profound insight, like a genuinely profound insight, and also like explains a lot of why a lot of folks are like,
yes,
we're just going to sort of see where it all goes.
I think, it was interesting being in Clayton, North Carolina yesterday as, Wall Street's melting down. The financial world is flipping out. Investors are calling Trump. People can't get through. It's a different reality in red state America. All the people that I talked to at that table had voted for Trump at least once, if not multiple times. And in part because of that, but I think largely because of the attitude you have to take when you are a farmer. You are more sanguine. You are more accepting of external chaos. But I kept saying, this isn't hurricanes, this isn't weather, this isn't an act of God. This is Donald Trump making very clear decisions that put you in financial peril. And it's not just that they sell their, goods to China, it's that they need farm equipment, they need lots of supplies that are manufactured in China, and they've already spent that money, Chris. The way it goes with a commodities trade is you've already put the money in the ground for the seed, the fertilizer, the equipment, the labor. They just got to hope come harvest time that they can sell it at a decent price and don't lose money. And Trump has thrown all of that up in the air, right? But what's so interesting, I think, is the empathy they feel with him insofar as the project of correcting a trade imbalance that they see has been decades in the making. The kinship they feel with him in his political project to break things and upend the status quo, and the fundamental and unspoken belief that if it all does go to hell in a handbag, as it did in 2018, Donald Trump will make sure they are made whole. So I'm speaking of the bailouts that were offered, the money, the assistance that was granted to farmers in the last Trump trade war with China in 2018. And I asked them about that and whether that was something they expected and what they thought of other people who might not be so keen on that idea. This is that conversation. The assistance that the president put in place after the last tariff increase basically erased the financial gains from that tariff increase, which I think left a lot of people scratching their heads like, well, why are we doing this to begin with? Do you feel the same way?
I feel like in the last trade war, we kind of went through the short-term pain, and I'm wondering where the gain was, maybe. We kind of came out of it in a little bit of turmoil.
I think some people have not forgotten that, and they're saying, well, you know what? The people that voted to put this president in office, this is your guy. And if this is your guy, you got to roll with the policies he enacts. And, why should the rest of the country that didn't vote for him be bailing out farmers?
That's right. And they're also, those same people oftentimes demand that farmers address climate change and farmers adapt different technologies. And we have responded in spades with soil health initiatives, cover crops, using less inputs to produce more on less land with less water and higher labor costs. But those same people that make those demands are not willing to pay the cost for the American products in the store. They will buy the cheaper imported products that have much lower, their daily wage rate are less than what we have to pay an hour for our H-2A workers that are coming in. And the disparity when you're having somebody tell you how to do what you do best for a living and then not be willing to pay for the demands that they're making is laughable. We're fighting with one hand tied behind our backs because we're having to meet the regulations that are imposed to produce the quality food and address all of these other social issues we may or may not be responsible for. But at the same time, we're not seeing a return in the marketplace because American products are too expensive. And that's the tragedy of the American farmer is we produce the best and we meet the demands and we step up to the plate. But the consumer, when they go to the store, they're looking for the best deal and the best value.
It's the system that they had take issue with is the broader landscape for American farming in a global economy. And it's, I think, because of this decades-long feeling of inequity, that they'll basically go along with whatever Trump is trying to do to correct that imbalance. And anybody who stands in the way of that or says farmers don't get their due doesn't understand how difficult it is to be a farmer in America.
I mean, what's so interesting about that quote, I really think that guy's a really well-spoken and interesting fellow, is that the fundamental reality here is that one person's cost is another person's income.
Yes.
Always.
Yep.
This is Econ 101, and it's lost in so much of the debate here. So when he says...
cost of labor.
When people talk about costs going up, it's like when you talk about housing costs are high, it's like that's bad. But if you say home values are rising, it's like, well, that's good. And that depends on whether you want to get into a housing market or you own a house. If you say the cost of the corn we're growing is going up, well, that's good if you're a farmer.
Right.
But it's not good if you're the consumer. Right?
And they talked a lot about wage requirements and labor costs. And I think the issue they take is, unlike housing, it's not two side-by-side apartments, one built by, it's not an apartment building that's been imported from China that's standing next to an apartment building in New York City. They are competing in the global marketplace in a way that other commodities aren't.
Totally. But what's so crazy about this whole thing is we just had this whole election where everyone's consensus view, and I was there, I didn't lose my mind, was like prices are too high.
And I asked
and now we've come out of it, and it's like, Americans, we got to get over over this obsession with cheap stuff. It's like, we just did this. I was there every goddamn night.
And they are farmers who are also consumers themselves.
Yes.
They are going to be affected both in their livelihood and just as parents and people trying to put food on the table. And yet, Chris, I am telling you, Donald Trump has not lost them.
No, of course not. And again, I don't look. The way all this stuff works is, you could go find a rich Democrat who a Democrat's going to raise taxes on, and they're not going to leave the Democratic Party. Right?
Yes.
They believe in things other than that.
Yes.
But this thing about the cost is really driving me insane, because all of a sudden it's like we're all having this good faith conversation about like maybe the world of like cheap foreign imports isn't the best thing for America. It's like, well, yeah, maybe, but like, what were we just doing last year when all we talked about is how everything is expensive? Suddenly, like, the center of gravity of the conversation has shifted in a remarkable way. I'm very excited to listen to this episode of Trumpland.
It's a good one, I gotta say.
It's out now. Yeah, that was really great. Really great work, Alex Wagner. Thank you.
Thanks, buddy.
Despite all the turmoil with the markets, President Trump bragged about his trade policies last night at a Republican event in Washington.
I do think that the war with the world, which is not a war at all, because they're all coming here. Japan is coming here as we speak. They're in a plane flying, lots of them, all tough negotiators. But things that people wouldn't have given us 2 years ago, wouldn't have even thought of it 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 7, they're giving us everything. They don't want tariffs on themselves. And it's very simple. We're making deals, and people are paying tariffs. Countries are paying tariffs. I'm telling you, these countries are calling us up, kissing my ass. They are dying to make a deal. Please, sir, make a deal. I'll do anything. I'll do anything, sir. And then I'll see some rebel Republican, some guy that wants to grandstand, say, I think that Congress should take over negotiations. Let me tell you, you don't negotiate like I negotiate. We're going to win the midterm elections, and we're going to have a tremendous thundering landslide. I really believe that. And it's so important that we pass the big, beautiful bill, because that's going to be, and I really think we're helped a lot by the tariff situation that's going on, which is a good situation, not a bad. It's great. It's going to be legendary. You watch, legendary in a positive way, I have to say.
All right. Welcome back to Morning Joe. It is just exactly the top of the hour, our second hour of Morning Joe. Jonathan Lemire still with us. And joining the conversation, we have MSNBC contributor Mike Barnicle, NBC News senior business analyst and host of the 11th Hour, Stephanie Ruhle is with us, senior political columnist for Politico, Jonathan Martin, and host of Pablo Torre Finds Out on Meadowlark Media, MSNBC contributor Pablo Torre. What a great group for this hour. Stephanie, I'm going to let you start things off here. I'm curious what you think about China's response so far, but also what are you watching today, just basically?
Mika, this is a disaster. Almost everything you heard the president say right there absolutely isn't true. And we can just start with all of these countries are calling us begging for a deal. I just want to remind our audience, the last time we had a major trade negotiation in this country was during Donald Trump's first term. It was the trade deal between Canada and Mexico and the United States. All it really was a retweaking of NAFTA. That took 2 years to negotiate. So here we are. The president has launched an all-out trade war with the entire world, not just adversaries like China, but with our allies throughout the world. And what's happening? Markets are in free fall. And if you want to say, well, this isn't about markets, this is about bringing manufacturing back, this is about the heartland of America, well, then I would just stop you there. Because you know who this is going to decimate, Mika? Small businesses, right? Global trade unlocked prosperity around global growth for the last 55 years. The fact that we're sitting here giving credence to Donald Trump saying trade deficits are what's killing us. We've had trade deficits in the United States, in this country, for over 50 years. During that time period, our economy has grown 255%. And the fact that people are tiptoeing around him. We saw Bibi Netanyahu, who understands how trade deficits work, say, we're going to get rid of those. He knows that's not true. We watched Larry Kudlow, a true MAGA Republican, school Scott Bessent on how trade deficits work 2 days ago on television, as Scott awkwardly smiled because he knows the truth. So the business community, the political community is circling President Trump, just kind of nodding and tenderly saying to him, this might not work, when they full well know this is economic suicide. And we have not seen tariffs levied like this since Smoot-Hawley. And what did that do? It sent us into a depression, and it spiked unemployment to 25%. This is terrible news across the board.
Scott Bessent has been known to say that the tariffs are just an opening bid. They're not like a serious thing. But here we are. And a number of Republicans, to your point, Stephanie, they continue to voice concerns. They voice concerns over President Trump's tariffs. They see what's coming. And that's a lot of constituents calling their offices going, we're hurting. According to Axios, at least a dozen House Republicans are reportedly considering signing onto a bill that would curb a president's ability to impose tariffs. In the Senate, a similar bill with bipartisan support is gaining traction as well. But until either chamber takes action, it appears Republicans' only move is to publicly voice their worries.
So, Mr. President, if you're listening, you're probably not. But if you are, once again, pretty pleased with sugar on top. You've won. Please today call Secretary Bessent, your very able Treasury Secretary, and you and he sit down with every one of these countries that want to lower their trade barriers, and let's make a deal.
Who pays these high tariffs? In the short, medium term, it will be the consumer. It will be the consumer. And so I'm worried about the inflationary effect. I'm worried if there is a trade war, that we're going to have markets shutting down for American farmers.
I don't often agree with the members on the other side of the aisle, but in many cases here today, particularly when they're expressing concern about small businesses in their states, I'm hoping you're very, and I hope you and the president are very sensitive about companies potentially going bankrupt by these actions.
Well, I'm kind of old-fashioned, Larry. I don't like taxes, and I don't want more of them. I also think that if you tax something, you get less of it. And I don't want less trade. I want more trade. There's a fundamental argument we have to have in this country. Is trade good or bad? The president and his counselors seem to think that in trade, someone gets ripped off. The truth of the matter is this, that all trade is mutually beneficial, and really the U.S. doesn't trade with China. You trade with Walmart. So when I go to Walmart, if I pay $10 for a shirt, I want that shirt, and they want my $10, and we both go away from the deal having succeeded. We mutually benefited. That's the only reason trade happens. And then if you add it all up and say, oh, China's ripping us off, it makes no sense. Trade deficits are not real accounting. It's a fake accounting, and it doesn't mean anything. What means something is if you look at trade deficits in proportional to prosperity, the higher the trade deficits, the more prosperity. The lower the trade deficits, the less prosperity. We get a reduction in trade deficits when we go into a recession. We get an expansion of trade deficits when we're in a boom. So really nothing about a trade deficit gives any real useful instruction to the economy.
Well, actually, I don't know whether you're surprised or not, but I agree with you about trade deficits. Actually, I've been riffing about it on the show. That's, I think, a lousy benchmark.
All right, so that just happened, and I want to get to J. Martin Pablo. But, Stephanie, you call this a disaster. We had Jared Bernstein in our last hour calling these tariffs burning down the House. And what do you make of what Senator Rand Paul was saying right there?
He was speaking truth. What's interesting is Rand Paul exactly walked through how global trade works. But you even heard Senator Kennedy there basically saying, pretty please, Mr. President, you've won. Pretty please, he's saying to the President of the United States, knowing how devastating this is. And that right there shows how they're all tiptoeing around the president. And do you know who's watching this? The rest of the world. And I think it's really important for our audience to understand one of the things we're losing is our soft power. We're losing our credibility. The rest of the world has watched in the last 10 weeks us start to ignore the rule of law. They're watching Congress, who has the power, has the ability to take power back away from the president, and they're not. Instead, they're pleading with them. So Other countries are watching this, and they're suddenly starting to say American exceptionalism is gone, and they cannot be a trusted partner if this is how they're operating. And let's just hope that's a momentary feeling, because when you lose credibility in buckets like this, it takes years for it to come back, because this is the greatest country in the world, and we are the most prosperous, with the best research, with the best science, with the best education, with the best business. So let's not let this momentary craziness that's happening in Washington destroy the American brand for the long term.
Yeah, the word trust is so important here when it comes to this sewing this whole thing together, or keeping it together, which right now is completely falling apart in terms of our economy and our interdependence around the world that took years to get to.
Last night, President Trump hinted at a pharmaceutical tariff still yet to come.
He said 24 years of this, which I think is plenty given his lack of production. It's hard to think of the things that he's done good for Texas or for the country. I can certainly point to many things like his gun restrictions, his lack of wanting to fund a border wall and disagreeing with President Trump on that, and even opposing President Trump's election in 2016 and the most recent election.
All right, so what is Trump promising? Today, Scott Bessent said that some of those tariffs, including on the pharmaceutical industry, are still on the table. Joining us now is CNBC health and pharmaceutical reporter Angelica Peebles. All right, the U.S. imports over $200 billion worth of pharma products last year. What would putting these tariffs on products mean for Americans? Is my insurance company going to cover that gap, or am I going to be paying for it?
Well, we have to see what the details are. Of course, the president has talked about something like a 25% tariff, similar to what we've seen on cars. And the question then becomes, well, what happens to that price increase? Do companies just absorb it, or do they pass it on? And so they're a little bit more limited in what they can do on the branded side, so those drugs that you know the name of, because they can only raise the price about the rate of inflation. And if they go higher than that, then they have to pay rebates to Medicare and Medicaid. So that limits them. But either way, the price of those drugs is so high that Brookings says that you will still feel the pinch of them. Now, what happens if the insurance company passes that on remains to be seen. But the other interesting part is on the generic side, because those companies just have less room to work with anyway. These are low margin products that make up the bulk, actually about 90% of the prescription drugs that are dispensed in this country. And those prices are so low that they don't really have a whole lot of room to raise those prices. So Brookings says that you might see things like discontinuations of drugs, but also drug shortages. So those are a few things to keep an eye on.
And I want to clarify for our audience, we accidentally rolled the wrong sound there. What the president, what Bessent said was, we're going to be announcing very shortly a major tariff on pharmaceuticals, quote, and when they hear that, they will leave China, they will leave other places because they have to sell. Most of their product is sold here, and they're going to be opening up their plants all over the place. How have the pharmaceutical companies themselves, what have you heard from the industry? How have they responded?
So, of course, the industry does not want to see tariffs. This is an industry that's basically been exempt for tariffs for about the last 30 years. So this would be quite a shock to them. And the industry is trying to tout the fact that about 2/3 worth of the prescription drugs used in the U.S. are actually made here. That number is skewed, though, of course, because the more expensive drugs are overrepresented and the cheap generic drugs are largely underrepresented. And like I said, the bulk of those are coming from overseas. And you have seen some companies move their manufacturing here. That's largely as a result of the 2017 tax cuts. So Eli Lilly has been one company that has been investing heavily in the U.S., but they also are trying to ramp up production of their GLP-1 drugs, of course. And so we've seen a few more manufacturing announcements, but they are going to have to make the decision here about what's more effective. Is the tax breaks overseas? Is that a better calculation? Or is it more advantageous to move their manufacturing? But these are long-term investments. It takes about 4 to 5 years to open a manufacturing plant. So one lawyer I talked to said that there's just so much uncertainty right now that why would any company make such a big long-term decision at this point?
That's what we keep talking about. The market abhors uncertainty. All right, CNBC's Angelica Peebles, thank you so much for breaking that down.
And joining us now is Sunny Kim, the owner of American Made Apparel Manufacturing. It's a Denver-based cut and sew factory. And Sunny, I'm very grateful for your time. I know you're the owner of American Made Apparel Manufacturing. How much of what you make comes from China?
Well, honestly, as much as we want to keep material costs here in America, we have to still source from China. So we're talking about thread and notions, and a lot of the materials that we use at some level have to come from China. So as much as we try to, let's say a garment will take some fleece fibers and we cut and sew it here in Denver, but at some level, it has to be impacted by Chinese sourcing, because let's say I want to buy the fabric is then knitted in LA, but they themselves have to get the yarn, which then comes from China. So at some level, there's always an impact because they still source from China. So it kind of gives you an idea that at every level of what we're trying to do here, it's still going to be interwoven at some level.
You know, Sonny, just from my own perspective, you know, watching the folks in Hialeah, Florida, which is an extraordinary city in South Florida, La Ciudad que Progresa, but there used to be 20 plus 30 years ago an entire manufacturing industry in this incredible city that was essentially eviscerated. Why has that happened? Why is it that you're finding it that you have to, in some step of this process, rely on China?
So, you know, as a wholesaler, we manufacture in bulk. So to manage costs and my prices to my clients, and obviously that affects at the retail level that they sell, everyone's going to be driven by the best price, best value. So for me, I have to definitely be mindful of that so that when they come to me, they have a choice to buy more in bulk. If I try to keep everything US made, it's almost impossible because, as I said earlier, at some level, I have to still use the thread. I still have to use the buttons or something that is produced in China. And there are certain things that US manufacturing still cannot achieve, whether it be some bamboo lycra fabric. Of course, that's going to come from China. Or if there's something very complicated, like a ski jacket that has many complicated steps, that is so labor intensive that at times it's just not possible in the US to produce such a thing and be affordable at the retail level.
Yeah, and so what is it you see down the line? What do you tell your employees?
So I am seeing an influx of inquiries every day in our inbox, showing that a lot of companies that once produced in China are trying to figure out if this is a viable option to come to US manufacturing. But to get there is going to be a big learning curve, and we have to start from ground zero. China might have everything set already up as far as infrastructure of all their fabric trims, thread, matching color, everything like that at their fingertips, right? Basically in the hub. Whereas for us, we pretty much have to start from ground zero as establishing what kind of fabrics they're using, what color is it, what grams per square meter they're using, all the way down to the details. And so for us to get up to the point of manufacturing the same level and capacity as China, I would say it's impossible. And so I am trying to use the people locally here, and that's going to be a good thing if we start getting some big accounts. But I have yet to see the benefit of tariffs happening yet because we haven't landed any of those yet.